The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Athletic. The race is on, and after just 2 races, Red Bull is piling the pressure on Daniel Ricciardo to up his game if he's to have any hope of keeping his seat, let alone a promotion, while the Mercedes technical team is working hard to troubleshoot the emerging weaknesses of its car. I'm Edd Straw, and join me to delve into those topics and answer your questions are Ben Anderson and Glenn Freeman. Well, Glenn, welcome back to the Race F1 podcast. You've been quite busy with the world of Bring Back V10s. Have you finished the latest season, I think, now?
Yep, the series has finished, Ed. Pretty sure you were on the last episode. But we are, of course, the new series won't start until July. But until then, we're doing lots and lots of bonus content for the Race Members Club. So I'll be calling upon you and Ben quite a lot over the coming weeks. And we'll have almost weekly releases for our members of bonus content. So I don't know when I'm going to start the research for the next series because I've sort of made myself too busy.
Well, that's always the challenge, isn't it? And Ben Anderson,
Hello.
Are you turning up with a real sense of shame after your performance on our Williams Bring Back V10s episode where you seem to put Ayrton Senna number 1 based on his imaginary Williams career?
Not shame exactly. I always stand by it. He was objectively the best driver in the list. So,
you've taken some heat for that in the Bring Back V10s community, I must say.
Well, I was damned if I did and damned if I didn't, because everyone expected me to put Damon Hill first, and that would have just been predictable. And my alternative choice is, I suppose, a stretch, but there's a logic behind it. And
at least you committed to it.
Yeah, exactly. 2-footed, full throttle, whichever
mixed metaphor you want to use.
Tortured sports metaphor you want to use.
That's what we like to see. Yeah. Well, if you have a listen to that one, what's it called? It's our top 10 Williams drivers of the Bring Back V10s era, isn't it? Yeah, that was season 9, episode 9. If you want to have a listen to that and just hear how wrong Ben is about so many things. That's always what those episodes showcase. And of course, I'm always right with my my rankings, which I think Glenn might support, because I think our positions were relatively similar across that podcast. There's still a few disagreements, but anyway,
there's no rules, Ed. That's the beauty of it. So no one's right and no one's wrong.
Well, you're wrong, but anyway.
Except you're wrong.
No. Well, I think we'll have to agree to disagree on that. But I'm the podcast
Always
host.
the words of someone who knows they're wrong.
I'm the podcast host here, so I can say
that's the racing incident excuse, isn't it? Two drivers collide. Whichever one says it was a racing incident was the guilty party.
Yeah, always the way. Anyway, let's get on with some more contemporary matters, Ben. We haven't had much cause to talk about Daniel Ricciardo so far this season.
No.
That's something Helmut Marko's changed by warning he must now come up with something soon in terms of his on-track performance. What do you make of that?
Well, I think in the big picture, Marko has a point, and it's nothing really different to what we kind of suspected at the end of last year. But I think the timing is a bit unfair. How has Marko got the time to focus closely on what Ricciardo's doing with everything else that's been going on at Red Bull behind the scenes? He can't have been paying a huge amount of attention to RB, I would have thought, in the first two races. So it's a bit soon. Nick de Vries got half a season before he was booted out. I wouldn't say that, Ricciardo needs to hurry up after two. But, he was, 10th and a half off Tsunoda in qualifying for the first race in Bahrain. He said that was on him, so he could have driven better. The gap was bigger in Saudi. It was 4.5 tenths, a bit more than 4.5 tenths. So on average, he's 3 tenths off. That's too big a gap. But he was ambiguously saying there was something fundamentally wrong with the car in Saudi Arabia that even if they didn't have park for May limitations, they wouldn't have been able to fix. So that could just be driver blaming the car, or there could be something actually that they get sorted for Melbourne and he's back on form. But I would say overall, he does have time to find. I would say the Saudi track where the gap was at its biggest, high speed, never the best for the RB/AlphaTauri characteristics. They were better last year in low speed than high speed. Also, if there is something fundamental about these rules that Ricciardo struggles with, which we have suspected since he struggled so much in the McLaren, high speed was where he tended to be, I think, the weakest compared to Norris. So Saudi would expose Ricciardo a bit more. So let's see. I don't think he meshes very well with the unpredictability that tends to underpin all of these cars in the ground effect era. And of course, as the teams are getting faster and trying to run lower and find more downforce, you can introduce a lot of instabilities. And I think they might perturb him a bit more than Tsunoda. I think is a bit better at handling the kind of unpredictability of a car, particularly on corner entry phase. So a lot to unpick for Ricciardo. A bit too soon to write him off this season, but the underlying pattern since he got into that car from the middle of last season to now is that Tsunoda, I think, is a little bit ahead. And I think Tsunoda also maybe has taken a step this year, knowing that he needs to beat Ricciardo to basically guarantee or give himself a shot at a future in F1.
It's a good point that if you look at it as 2 races into the season, it's way too early. And it will probably still be too early after Australia, Ricciardo's home Grand Prix. It's going to be tough for him, though, going into his home race. We always hear, don't we, what an exhausting week that is for him off track. You could do with on track going quite well and not having any distractions. But I think I'm very much of the opinion that it's too early. But if this has come, and we might be giving Helmut Marko too much credit here, but if this comes from a position of, well, I wasn't that convinced at the back end of last year, and I'm still not convinced now, maybe that makes a bit more sense. However, looking at it from a ruthless Red Bull point of view, Ricciardo said he's there because he wants to get himself back in a Red Bull racing car, an RBR, not an RB. If you want to do that, you have to be smashing Tsunoda, I think. So even if they were kind of neck and neck and both doing quite a good job, I don't think that's enough. To be behind him definitely isn't enough. The bar is high, and it's kept even higher if Sergio Perez keeps doing an okay job in the Red Bull seat that he's already got. Because if Ricciardo looks like a punt, I don't think Red Bull will do it. And then that raises a much bigger question of well, why is he still here? So he's not only got to get on terms with Tsunoda, he's got to start destroying him, I think.
I have a slight concern that Marco's imagined utopian view of Ricciardo is from the earlier Red Bull days alongside Max, before Max became the monster he is now. And they've stuck him in the car for that tyre test at Silverstone to kind of show that he was back. Marco's got excited, which he tends to do when somebody does a performance you're maybe not expecting in a one-off particular circumstance. Yes, exactly. And then what Ricciardo's done since, not shameful or terrible, but not as exciting or as impressive as maybe Marco imagined in his head he would be if they gave him a run. And therefore his mentality or his thought process with that driver starts to shift and then becomes quite hard to break out of that. So the warning, even if it is unfair, even if it is too soon, there will be some kind of underlying key disappointment there compared to what pedestal Marco's put that driver on in his own head. And that is a warning sign for Ricciardo, because it hasn't really gone that well. It's gone okay, but he looks at the moment very much like the sort of solid, dependable, experienced guy in a midfield team.
And that's not what he came back to do. He didn't come back to be okay.
No, he looks more like Alfa Romeo Kimi Raikkonen than he does Charles Leclerc Ferrari, for example. So, he needs to show more, even if this start to the season that we haven't seen enough yet to say he's completely on the ropes.
It's an interesting situation, because if Red Bull dispense with Perez and decide they want a solid number 2 driver, the bar's not super high for Ricciardo to clear, but he's still not got to that. I do also think, we asked why Marco was talking about this, and I think there is a connection to the whole Red Bull politics thing, because as I understand it, Horner is a little bit more behind pushing Ricciardo, maybe over and above Marco. So there's perhaps a little bit of a Marco seeing Project Ricciardo revival being a Christian Horner driven thing rather than a Helmut Marko driven thing. And there's always that dimension there. But to be quite honest, I don't think at this stage you can make a case for throwing Ricciardo in. And if you want to score it based on which of the 3 other Red Bull drivers who aren't Max Verstappen have done the best job over the first 2 races, it probably is Perez ultimately. And Tsunoda's been quicker than Ricciardo, and the race haven't gone great, but I don't think the RB's quite as strong in race trim as it is in qualifying trim either.
No, and you haven't got the best comparison either, because in the first race the strategies were slightly different, and then in the second race you had the kind of weird Kevin Magnussen roadblock situation, which kind of meant you didn't have everyone kind of running at their pace. But going back to your point about the bar, the fact that the bar is lower for the second driver in the main Red Bull team also means that Ricciardo has more competition, because there are many other drivers even outside the pool of Red Bull drivers who could do that job very well. So you kind of need to, especially with everything that's gone on with Ricciardo at McLaren, you need to see more from him to be fully convinced. He's not a young guy anymore. He's got experience, which is valuable, but there are lots of quick drivers who could do in theory, a dependable job as a number 2 in the Red Bull team. And
even just looking at RB's lineup, they've got Liam Lawson on their books, who had that impressive 5-race stint as a stand-in for Ricciardo last year. And frankly, Lawson did enough to earn himself a full-time drive for this year, really, in that stint, but he doesn't have it. So that complicates it. And Glenn, talking of Ricciardo potentially being in the way of Liam Lawson, we often hear complaints that vastly experienced drivers are blocking the way for the young stars of the future. Do you think F1's got the balance wrong here? And if so, why?
Not right now. But if for example, if Ricciardo doesn't perform exceptionally over the rest of this year, but keeps that drive because he's valuable to Red Bull in other ways, we hear a lot about his marketability and that sort of thing. So I think if he doesn't perform but keeps the drive next year and somehow keeps Lawson out of F1, then yes, absolutely. But right now, I don't see lots of drivers on the outside who are victims of this massive injustice. And I don't see that many drivers. I don't see lots of old guys. Ben mentioned Kimi Raikkonen earlier. Raikkonen probably hung around he had a good seat at Ferrari for a little bit too long. And then he had a seat at Sauber Alfa Romeo for a bit too long. I don't think there's much of that going on at the moment. I did rack my brains out. Really, if there's somebody clogging a seat at the moment, maybe Lance Stroll. You mentioned, Ed, you made that, you repeated that joke, I think, on the last podcast about how the back half of the grid are all trying to beat Lance Stroll to 10th because of the split between the top teams and the bottom teams. That's quite damning. And Stroll isn't an old guy clogging up a seat, but he's been around a long time. And if Aston Martin have got big ambitions, I'd say the quality of their second driver doesn't match that at the moment. You could maybe say that unless he takes a step this year, and it's always a bit harsh with inexperienced drivers, but Logan Sargent at Williams feels that unless he takes a big step this year, if he's still in that car next year, having not really performed, you could say he's blocking the path for someone. If F1 wanted to redress this balance, it could let more teams in, couldn't it? So we had more than 20 seats. We've got a team that's trying to get in, and they've been turned away in Andretti, and that would open up 2 more slots. But right now, I don't see any huge injustice. It's unfortunate for Lawson, but I think as long as he's on the grid next year, it's fine.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's almost 2 different categories of drivers who are knocking on the door of Formula One. There's the potential megastar ones, and then there's that larger group, which is people who could do a good job in Formula One, a good competent job, be at a decent level, but they're not going to be absolute superstars of the future. And you've got a couple of...
I think there are more Joe Guan Yus out there, people who would come in and go, oh yeah, that's fine. Like they're perfectly competent.
He's another who you could say is maybe clogging up a seat. He hasn't been particularly impressive to me. Wasn't particularly impressive in Formula 2, knocking on the door either. But
that's what I mean. He's an example of someone who wasn't exceptional in F2, but then got to F1 and didn't look completely out of his depth. So I think there are lots of drivers out there like that. The other example I had for next year, if, for example, and I don't think this is going to happen, if say Kevin Magnussen keeps his drive at Haas and Ollie Behrman ends up being Haas reserve or something, that would be an injustice next year. But right now, Magnussen having that drive and Behrman, despite his brilliant debut in Saudi, him still being in F2 isn't an injustice to me. He needs that extra season, and I think he'll be a more rounded driver next year because of everything he's doing this year.
And I'd say Lawson probably was also in that category, a bit like Zhou, someone coming up who didn't make an overwhelming case for themselves to be in Formula One.
Yeah, Lawson's impression came from getting his F1 shot,
and then he gets the shot and actually looks quite decent. But it's a small sample set. You don't know how he would do given the full season, whether he would kick on or not. Obviously, some guys who are really impressive in the junior categories then get to F1 and are a bit underwhelming, so it can go both ways. But your overall point stands, Glenn. It's like you have to kind of make an overwhelming case from underneath, and there's probably Behrman, maybe Antonelli. I know that's a lot of hype at the moment, who look, based on what they're doing at the moment, like they're inevitably going to be an F1, and that creates pressure from underneath. And there's probably a gaggle of 4 or 5 guys on the current grid who are absolutely fine. I'm not sure about Sargent. He's maybe, I think, not quite cut out for it, but even he was 4th in F2, so that shows you the bar you have to get to in the championship below, where even being beyond that is quite hard. And then to be outstanding, you've got to be really, really very good in F2, not so much results, but performance-wise. I'd say people like Stroll, Magnussen, Zhou, they're guys who are on the grid circumstantially, not through overwhelming performance metrics, if you like. So there is wriggle room, and the only time it gets, I think, unfair is then when you've got guys like maybe Behrman who are making an overwhelming case to be on the grid at some point in the future, next year probably, and then they don't. That's not really on, because although the grid I think has got stronger and the pay driver thing has definitely receded as the teams have got stronger, there's still, as ever, some wriggle room at the back part of the grid.
Yeah, and there's also drivers like Felipe Drugovich and Theo Pourchaire, who are both F2 champions, who again, they're not all F2 champions are equal. Let's put it that way. Sometimes
they took too long, didn't they? I think
exactly.
They'd be fine if they had a seat, but
absolutely,
again, they don't fall into that injustice camp for me.
No, agreed.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth remembering that Formula One teams, their job is to assemble the best driver lineup they can. They're not obliged to bring in fresh blood or whatever. They will pick what they think is going to do the best job for them, and that sometimes factors in wider considerations other than necessarily what the driver brings. We've talked about what Ricciardo brings commercially to RB, and obviously they're pushing that side with their terrible new team identity, and obviously Joe.
Oh, if he's responsible for that, let's get rid of him.
Right now.
He's Visa and all the other lots signed up.
I don't think he's responsible for the terrible naming. He did a very good job in Bahrain of trying to justify the name, and he didn't sound very convinced by it, but he said all the right things anyway. But you've also got Joe, obviously, who opens up the Chinese market. That's been particularly good, actually, less so for Chinese companies coming in to back that team, although there have been some, and it's actually more about US and European companies wanting to get into China by being associated. So there's an interesting sort of reversal of, I think, what people
that makes sense.
assume happens there.
And Sargent ticks the US box for Williams, right? They want to push more into that area business-wise.
Yeah, and Logan Sargent, he's not a big name by any stretch of the imagination in the US. But in the US market, sometimes just having someone who is seen as a US driver is important. I know he's been used in some of Duracell's North American advertising stuff, so he's useful for that. And Williams obviously is really pushing the US side. They've got a base in New York, a commercial base, which is really pushing that side of things. But yeah, I'd certainly agree. Sargent, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, he's got a turn of speed, and there's sort of a driver in there somewhere. But the longer it is before it
I'm not convinced.
comes out,
I'm not convinced.
You just start to think, I'm just not convinced he can bring it all together. Unfortunately,
it's more Latifi Mark II at the moment, I think.
Yeah, maybe there's sort of I think there's a bigger upside in there potentially, but he needs to start accessing that regularly, because you can't just constantly be, well, there were flashes of good and it didn't come together. That element, I guess, is similar to Latifi. But yeah, the driver market is going to be very interesting this year as it moves on. The strata that the younger drivers can come into, that's not really in play yet. We need to work out what happens with the front running seats now. But obviously Behrman's performance is a good reminder that there are capable drivers knocking on the door. And just before we finish part one of the podcast, a quick reminder about the survey our friends at The Athletic are running. They want to hear from you. They're asking you to fill out a quick survey about you and your podcast habits by going to theathletic.com/survey24. 3 lucky entries will win $100 or £100 worth of Amazon vouchers as well. So whether you're a long-time listener or a new one, we want your feedback. Go to theathletic.com/survey24. That's theathletic.com/survey24. And the link also is in our episode description.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done. Right, Ben, let's get on to Mercedes now. Despite all that pre-season testing optimism, there seem to be some rather familiar problems for it. Are you surprised these have persisted?
I don't think I'm surprised anymore. I'm disappointed because, as I was saying last year, I felt like Ferrari and Mercedes let Formula One down by not kicking on properly and giving Red Bull a pretty much free run at it. And this year, they seem to be eliminating the obvious excuses, but fundamentally they just seem at least a year behind the curve, and it remains the case since the ground effect era started. 22, they were too aggressive with the design, too much bouncing. The rules got changed to raise the floor height, which is something they pushed for. And then 2023, even though they got the FIA to encourage the FIA to change things to kind of eliminate their big problem, the bouncing, they decided, as James Allison explained to you, Ed, not to kind of go into that region of development, that window lower to the ground. A bit like a nervous swimmer, instead of just jumping in at the deep end and going, yeah, this is where we can go now, they kind of tried to go in at the shallow end and wade slowly towards where they needed to get to.
Climbed in via the steps.
Yeah, climbed in via the steps. Yeah, oh, it's a bit cold. Back the other way, and then down again.
Get your shoulders in.
Yeah, exactly. So they kind of ended up not really getting into the window they needed to, and thinking that everyone else also would be scared of the deep end, like they were, and obviously they weren't. And then they could still hide behind certain things to do with, the fundamental architecture of the car being designed around different concept. They've kind of got less of those issues now because they've had a proper run at it in the winter and changed the suspension configuration, etc. But they're still hitting the same problems. Still the bouncing is there. As soon as they go to higher speed and lower ride heights, the car hits the ground. They get, I presume, airflow separation. They can't manage it properly underneath. And then the car doesn't work. It gets nervous. The drivers lose confidence and they can't get the lap time. And it was interesting listening to Toto Wolff talk about it on the Sunday after Saudi. And he gave this jokey answer at one point about, how are you dealing with this kind of, consecutive and sustained disappointment? And he said, he joked that it was about pills. They prescribed him Valium and up the dose and what have you. But the way he was speaking, it's like he's almost resigned himself and he's got this coping mechanism now to just be kind of bright and breezy about it, because at the same time he used this word fundamental. There's something fundamental they're missing and they still haven't got it even 3 years in. I'm guessing it's to do with the floor. They don't know how to design the floor properly. They were really, really good in the previous generation of F1 with the clever, intricate top body aero surfaces. And now it's more about what's going on underneath. I just think they're behind in their knowledge and understanding of how to make that work in a way that other teams aren't.
The big thing for me, we heard, you hinted at them, Ben, we heard all these excuses last year of, we only need, it's all about doing X and Y. We just need to, we need to redo the chassis. That's giving us a fundamental architecture limitation. We think we understand this, we understand that. The big thing for me in pre-season, when that car was launched, I thought, right, this car will tell us if Mercedes understand these rules. And what we've seen so far tells us that they still don't. So, you said they're a year behind. I think they might even be more than that behind. It's, I just think they're lost. And I had a question probably for you, Ed. Obviously, Mercedes made big technical team changes last year with Allison coming back in, Mike Elliott kind of being pushed out of the fray, or moving out of the fray, volunteering himself perhaps. Did those changes happen soon enough that what we're seeing now is the fully realised kind of Allison-led picture, or will Mercedes start telling us soon that, actually, because of when James came back, it's the 2025 car that will fix all the problems?
Well, it depends what the problem's traced to, because it seems clear there's some limitations with the simulation tools they're using, because one of the big problems they've got is at certain speeds, when the floor is pretty low, it's not producing the downforce anticipated. So the big question is why there? Is it fundamentally an approach-based thing? Is it a tool-based thing? Or is it the approach hasn't allowed them to refine the tools? Because they've been working on this ever since the start of the ground effect era. I remember Mike Elliott talking about that at the end of 2022 as a big thing they'd done, trying to give themselves the necessary tools to actually do this. So there's still something that they're missing. And that ultimately is the key to understanding why Mercedes isn't solving this. Why haven't they found the way to do it? And why were they in a position where they thought they'd fixed it? Because I asked George Russell about this in Bahrain before the weekend when he was talking about the rear stability, the greater confidence they had. And I said, well, are you worried that I think I phrased it, if you tomorrow ran in the first sector at Suzuka, how do you know you wouldn't have the same problem? And he said, well, there's nothing that's telling us that's still going to be a problem. And then, of course, they go to Jeddah with its faster corners, and it was a problem. So, yeah, they did think that wasn't going to be a problem, and it was. That, for me, is the biggest concern.
That's a massive red flag, isn't it?
Yeah, so that there's a
Huge
gap in
red
knowledge.
flag, yeah.
And although Andrew Shovelin's talked about how the team's going to work really hard in the build-up to Australia to try and do things better, and it's a question for me of, if something's not working, why is it not working? I doubt if it's in the realm of just setup that you can fix this, because it seems there's just a little dead spot, if you like, where they're not producing the downforce. Gary Anderson suggested in the Race F1 Tech Show, which you can listen to now, that it'll be all about, as the car builds load and therefore gets lower because it's pulled down to the ground more, you actually want to create a little bit of a controlled stall effectively, because you want the downforce still to be there, but you don't want it to keep growing, because then you will hit the ground, and that's a problem. And so controlling that
you need like a release valve, don't you?
Exactly, yeah. You almost vent a little bit of it. And then, so ideally you want to get down to a certain height, pretty low, where you're safe and you're not going to hit the ground, and you want to stop it building more downforce at that point. So yeah, you vent it, you release a valve, you dimmer switch it, whatever you want to say. And Gary's suggestion is that's not working as hoped. Maybe it's just becoming more of a binary switch, and they're just losing a load of downforce, and that can induce porpoising as well, because you get the airflow separating, reattaching, and you get into that cycle. So it'll be somewhere in the fine detail of the floor, the topography of the ceiling of the underfloor, the floor edge design, that kind of thing, that the answer will lie. That's the one positive, though, because they have fixed some architectural things. They did need to do that. That's all positive and has helped. But at least if it's in what you might call the soft parts of the car, the bits you can make new ones of, you can solve it if you understand it.
But in that same interview that Alison gave to you at the end of last year, Ed, he said that region that they were scared of getting into last year was really difficult or impossible to simulate properly, which is part of the reason I think they didn't do it. And they were kind of calculating that others would stay away from there, as he put it, try to find downforce higher up where it's more difficult, because actually where the good, easy downforce, actually you can't simulate effectively. But people have managed to do it. And Mercedes, I feel like, are trying this year, because they've eliminated these other architectural weaknesses / excuses. You know, they've got better suspension, they've got a better platform overall, but they can't simulate, can they? Because they're trying to, and Wolf is basically saying, we're simulating this and it's showing X result, but actually when we get to the track, it's Y different. So I think they're stuck in a bit of a negative feedback loop, where they're a team that spent a lot of time building and trusting their simulation tools, because of course that replaces testing in this day and age and has for a while. They're used to those tools being really quite good and accurate and allowing them to start weekends properly, as they did so relentlessly for many years. And now there's a key part of the car that has to get into a very narrow window that they just can't simulate properly, and they aren't calibrated to kind of throw all that simulation out and do it, I guess, in an old-fashioned way. Obviously, I'm not an engineer, I don't know how you would do it, but they seem to want to trust these tools implicitly, and every time over the last 3 years, those tools are letting them down in a really key, fundamental way.
Well, you kind of have to trust the tools, because that's what you design it based on. So it gets very difficult to do without that. And obviously, yeah, you can't simulate it in the wind tunnel when you've got a car right on the floor, because you can't thwack the model into the belts. That gets quite expensive and quite destructive. CFD, as I understand it, as you move the floor closer to the ground, the calculations become exponentially more complicated. But other teams, Red Bull, for example, have found ways to do this. And so it seems to be an underlying question of the underlying science and understanding how you can do that. And maybe the fact that they stayed away from that a little bit in the past has hurt them a bit as well. So they've made some progress in sharpening up the tools. And then you think, okay, we think we've got it right. And then you run the car and you discover you haven't. So then you have to feed that all back into sharpening your tools. It's very, very difficult for them. But it's a problem, because if you look at it, Ferrari have done a pretty good job this year. Yes, they're off Red Bull's pace, but they appear to have what Mercedes wanted, which was a car that's kind of honest and true and working and doesn't have a fundamental limitation. And their challenge now is just to keep adding performance to it, because it's doing what they expect. And if they can develop at a slightly faster rate than Red Bull, they will gradually close the gap. That's where Mercedes wants to be and isn't. And all the time Mercedes spends troubleshooting is time it's not gaining.
Yeah, I would just say on Ferrari, I feel like Ferrari have, in contrast to Mercedes, Ferrari have delivered on what they said at the end of last year. They said they understood the car. They got more out of last year's car at the end of the year. And then they have made a step with this year's car. It's just being made not to look as impressive because Red Bull found a bunch more performance as well. But you had Mercedes and Ferrari. We do group them together because they're the other big teams. As Ben said, they're the ones up to now really letting F1 down from a competitive standpoint. But one, they both kind of said that they knew what they needed to do. I feel like one has done it and one is still lost. You know, if Mercedes take their armbands off in the deep end, they're just going to drown.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely fair. And ultimately, it's Ferrari and Mercedes who should be blamed more than anyone else for the current dominance.
It's their fault, not Red Bull's.
Red Bull are doing a great job. They're doing everything they should do. Well done to them. Mercedes and Ferrari have everything they need to do the same, and they've not. So that's where the problem lies. Now, we've got a number of questions on Lewis Hamilton from the Race Members Club. We'll tackle those here because it fits in nicely thematically with Mercedes. We'll get on to some other questions shortly after. Glenn, a very simple first question, if slightly incendiary for certain fans, from Alexander Dallendorfer, who says, has Lewis Hamilton given up?
It's a brilliantly blunt question, Alexander. I don't think he's given up. I think he's incredibly frustrated and disappointed. He... Much like we've just spent that last section saying we'd heard all the Mercedes excuses and we'd heard the promises that it would all be better this year. It's, if you're a neutral fan who wants competition at the front, it's frustrating that this team is failing to deliver on that. Imagine if you drive for them. It must be a 1,000 times more disappointing. It's also a confusing time probably for Lewis now in that he knows he's only there for one more year. So I guess at some point he's got to process the fact of, okay, I guess I just get the best out of this car. I don't really have to worry about trying to fix it for next year. I've just got to try and help them make this one better. But that probably makes it harder to work out how he feels about, for himself, to work out how he feels about this year. Because if he knew he was sticking to a longer term Mercedes contract, then you go head down with everybody. Come on, let's go and let's fix this. Let's keep getting better every year. Now he's kind of got to decide what's the most I can get out of this year. When do I start turning my attention to driving the red cars? I would also add that it's not uncommon for Lewis to start seasons a bit more slowly than his teammates, even when there were some really good Mercedes cars that he was driving. If you look at the Bottas years, for example, Bottas often compared more favourably to Lewis in the first few races of the year. Then Lewis got his head around the car and would take a step. The question is, I guess, can he do that with a fundamentally poor car that he probably doesn't get on with in the same way that he did with his championship winning cars eventually?
It does at least justify his decision to leave early, doesn't it?
Massively.
All those people pre-season who were like, oh, but what if the Merc's really good? And then he's,
he'll feel hugely vindicated by that at least.
Exactly, yeah, because there's a clear gap. Last year you could say Ferrari, Merc, very much a sideways step either way, but now Ferrari seem to have actually, like you say, Glenn, delivered on what they said they were going to do.
Ferrari's a step up.
They're a step up, yeah. There's a B tier behind Red Bull and then a C tier of other front-running teams front-running. In inverted
Maybe
commas,
he's timed it well again.
So yeah, I mean he'll be feeling relieved, partly I think that,
and then impatient. It's like you've got to wait another 22 races
exactly,
to get in the car.
I think also it does underline that probably Hamilton had an idea this was going to happen when he committed to moving to Ferrari.
Yeah.
I never believed.
You could tell at the end of last year in those interviews he gave, that he's, that stuff he was saying about it made him question himself for a period, and then he's obviously gone, no, hang on, it's not me. It is the team, and everything we're seeing now says that he was right to have those doubts. And
we all thought that, didn't we? We thought when the Ferrari news broke, we thought, is that a sign that he doesn't like what he's seen from Mercedes, what they've got coming? And I guess that is true. I guess that's what happened.
And he would have had more distrust going into this year than any other, because 22 he got
he's been
the
let
full
down 2
sell.
years in a row.
Yeah, and he was like, oh no, that'd be fine. And then it took him half the year to get over the disappointment of it being so bad. And then 23 was obviously a bit less sure-footed about it. But still, if you've been with a team for that long and had so much success, you're going to trust what they say. And then again, it was a letdown. I think this year he was like, Probably switched off at the end of last season and thought, well, yeah, they're saying sort of the same stuff, but what's actually changed? It's
where's
still
the evidence that I should trust them?
Yeah, there's no. Obviously, Toto always likes to say there's no silver bullet in F1, but I think for Lewis, he probably hasn't seen enough change behind the scenes or enough clear indication that they've grasped it and they're going to do these 3 or whatever steps to actually make it different to the years before, and just gone, I've had enough, guys.
Ultimately, I never really believed the idea that he would turn his back on Mercedes just for the sake of the Ferrari dream if he didn't have a reason to think that Ferrari would at least be as good and ideally be a better prospect. A question now for you, Ben, also on Lewis Hamilton from Greg Skinner, who says, what's going on?
Keep them coming.
What's going on with Hamilton's street track qualifying since the new ground effect rules came in? I've noticed there's been a continual struggle, which is strange, as in previous eras he was excellent and race pace has always been strong. Is it just age or something about this new rule set that means he cannot access his full talent at street circuits?
Yeah, interesting question. And I think it's tempting on the surface to lean that way. The gap between Hamilton and Russell fundamentally in terms of qualifying pace is very small. Depending on how you slice it, Russell's slightly ahead on average, I think. So he's definitely had a tougher time than he's been used to in the past in terms of teammate comparison. And also coming off of Saudi, which in this rule set is definitely a bogey track for him. He's been rubbish each of the 3 years compared to Russell. 22, you give him a bit more license, I think, because the car was so bad. As the team leader, he took on that responsibility of, I'm going to do more of the wacky setup experiments to try and help, zone in on something a bit more sensible. But to extrapolate it to across the board on street tracks, I don't think that's really fair. Setting aside that 2022 experimental setup period, the wet Singapore qualifying sessions at the end of the year, he was top 3 right throughout, and ahead of Russell. Baku 23 was ahead of Russell. Monaco last year was ahead in Q3. Singapore, he was out qualified by Russell, but was, I think, probably better in the race overall in terms of how he managed the tyres and got up into the lead group at the end. I do think there's an element, and Glenn touched on this earlier, of Russell, where he's come from. And we saw this a bit, I think, with Ricciardo when he got into Red Bull against Vettel. He's been more used to driving bad cars and doing well in them. And then you get into kind of a better team and everything's a step up. So you kind of go with that, but you also have a much more kind of refined, up-to-date knowledge of bad cars in this moment and how to get the most out of them. I feel like Lewis's strength is more, as Glenn said, he tends to start seasons a bit slowly. In the good days, the good old days for Merck, when they would develop the car really well through a season, he would go with that. They would start adding grip and finding lap time, and he would just keep going and going and going with the car, whereas a driver like Bottas would plateau. He wouldn't be able to make the same steps. I feel like in this generation, Merck aren't ever getting to that point. So they just have a season of the bad car where Lewis is kind of reined in by that, and he can't access his best stuff. Which,
well, you can't develop a car if you don't understand
exactly, and they're not finding the gains that his strength is as the car basically gets harder to drive and faster on the limit, and it's more ambiguous, and you need more precision, etc. At that peak of grip, they're just not. Then he's never getting there, so he's kind of got an artificial ceiling, I think, on his potential. And the longer it goes on, the more tempting it is to write him off, especially at his age. And even he's obviously questioned himself, as he said last year. But then he does something like Hungary last year in qualifying, where the stars align and the grip is there and the car's working, and he produces a special lap to get pole position. And you think, oh, actually, yeah, he's still capable of driving as well as anyone. It's just, I think, the car is letting him down more than he's letting himself down.
And a question now from Shane Moss. It's actually the final part of his question, because he asked various things about Mercedes and Hamilton and Russell that we've already talked about. But his final part of the question is, would it actually be wise for Alonso to even consider Mercedes with the issues they have with the car? Which I think is a really interesting question, because obviously Alonso will be looking at the way the driver market's working, thinking, oh, I could have a chance here. I'm an available world champion. And it's not clear cut whether Mercedes would be a better place to go than Aston Martin. It actually feels like a bit of a coin toss now, insofar as you're weighing up Mercedes' historic success against the potential for Aston Martin's future success. So I don't think it's a slam dunk that you definitely want to be in the Mercedes, although I still think he'd probably have in the back of his mind that maybe Mercedes is sort of a 55-45 split better. That's why ultimately Alonso wants to wait, I think, but he's under pressure to decide because not everyone's going to wait for him.
I think if that ends up being his choice and he has the option, I think he does have to take it. It kind of comes back to what we said about Hamilton. Hamilton would have seen what was going on at Mercedes and could make, even if he didn't know exactly what was going on at Ferrari, he could make an informed decision based on what was going on at Mercedes. Alonso would be able to do that with Aston Martin. If what feels like a bit of an Aston Martin plateau continues, and if he can't see the big step that we all thought they were, we thought they were on a sort of rocket trajectory this time last year. It really has, it's flattened out. I don't think they look that brilliant at the start of this year. So if he's looking going, these are kind of two teams in similar situations, but one is at least going from a higher base, that one being Mercedes. I think you take it as it is a step up, and you gamble because he doesn't have time. Time is not on Fernando Alonso's side. Even if he does race until he's 50, like I think he said recently, you take it in the hope that it pays off eventually, but you make that decision based on if you think Aston Martin's going anywhere. So I think if he gets the opportunity, he takes it. That tells us something about where Aston Martin's real progress is heading.
And he said during the race in Saudi, when having, I think, out-qualified where the car should be, the Aston's probably fifth best, isn't it, out of the top 5 teams, pretty much. But he's picking off a few, in theory, faster cars. In the race, he was saying to his team, what can we do? They're in a different league, and he was including the Merc within that. So I think already Aston aren't on Mercedes level. Alonso will, as Glenn was alluding to, know that from deep inside the team. So even if Mercedes aren't what they should or could be, in theory, they are still, at the moment, a fundamental step up on being in Aston Martin. I'm not convinced about Aston making some huge leap forward in the next year. I think they're clinging on to the top group. So it's whether Alonso wants that kind of baby step towards the front rather than just kind of sticking with what he's got.
Yeah, and the hope of maybe a proper step back in 2026, even if 2025 isn't there. So, I think it all sort of says Mercedes is probably the better choice, but it's not a slam dunk, is it? That's the difficult thing for him. And ultimately, I think in Saudi Arabia, Mercedes should have been beating Alonso. Russell felt he should have qualified a little bit better. So, I think he'd have been ahead of Alonso had I was going to say Saturday, had Friday, as it was, gone a little bit better. Well, as we had so many questions from the Race Members Club to answer after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, we didn't have the chance to get through all of them, so we're taking on some more in this episode. And we're delighted to have so many of you in the Race Members Club. So if you'd like to join and enjoy the many benefits membership has to offer, there's a link in the description for this episode. And don't forget, you can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Glenn, let's come to you first. A question from Ascari Cantonen, who says, lots of people complain about DRS trains. Why don't they assign a maximum number of DRS uses per race, or say a minute of free DRS use in the race to get around this problem?
Yeah, I like the idea because it's such a weird. I think it's a weird phenomenon that we probably didn't see coming with DRS, because you would always assume that the car at the front of the train would be vulnerable, so you would get overtaking rather than them all just driving around together with their wings open. Other series have taken different approaches to DRS in the past that maybe we could learn from here. I covered Formula Renault 3.5, which introduced it for a bit, and they had a time limit. So you had an amount of it per race that you could use whenever you liked. What I don't like about kind of free use for a set amount of time is that drivers would be able to use it in clear air to build gaps. So you could actually make the racing worse. And you think of someone like, if you've got Max Verstappen at the front of the field, if he just eats up a load of his DRS in the first few laps to break 5 seconds clear of everybody, that actually makes the racing worse. So what you could do, I think it's DTM had a thing actually where it was kind of a combination of the two. I think they based it on, you had to be within a second of the car in front at the start finish line, And then I think you had either free use or multiple uses for the rest of that lap. So I think that kind of found the best of both worlds. So I like the idea of you having to use it strategically rather than just within 1 second, I've heard the beep in my ear, I'll press the button on this straight. I like the idea of choosing where to use it on the track, but also having to use it carefully, because if you run out, you'll be vulnerable later. So I think there are things we could do here. Some people will say that's too confusing. I never really buy that argument, because I think those who want to understand these things will. Those who don't want to understand it don't need to. They just see that cars are racing each other. If the commentators do a good job, you'll understand that so-and-so is vulnerable because he's used up his DRS advantage. It wouldn't be that complicated.
I think the strategy point you make is a really good one, because you've kind of got a mismatch where DRS is restricted to, like you say, certain zones, beep, almost an automated process. It happens for this set length of straight and then it's done. But the defending car has much more variation in terms of how they store their hybrid energy, how they deploy it, where they use that in terms of defense. So you've kind of got more strategic variation in the defensive position and none in the attacking position. And it kind of makes sense if you want to even it out a bit, but you're at completely extreme ends of the spectrum there. So maybe there's some way to bring a bit more tactical deployment in the attacking sense to kind of marry up with the defensive element, especially as all the cars are getting quicker and therefore harder to follow. So the more of the emphasis is with the defending car again than it was, say, at the start of 22.
More variables is never a bad thing.
Well, variables are what create racing. Ultimately, that's what allows people to pass each other. Ben, a question now for you from Kieran Lister, who says, have Williams sacrificed a car of many weaknesses but one huge strength in 2023's model for a replacement which is merely okay everywhere?
Well, maybe. It's probably a bit too soon to say after just 2 races. But philosophically, they have to do that and break that mould if they want to become a serious team longer term, which is the stated aim, obviously, since going back some time, but certainly since James Vowles took over. I'd say also in their defence, the midfield is congested, so you can't really afford to kind of let everyone else develop in that way and just go, yeah, we'll be all right on sort of 3 tracks where you don't need any downforce. It's not really going to work. I mean, there was half a second from Sonoda in P9 to Sargent in 19th in Q1 in Saudi Arabia. Bottas was within a 10th of knocking Albon out. So that just shows you how competitive it is in that region, and the difference between being in the top 10 and out in Q1, or on the fringes of the top 10, or being out in Q1 for a team like Williams is very, very small. I think if they have less load and more straight line speed, like they have tended to have relative to other teams, they don't qualify anywhere near as well as Albon did in Saudi. So instead of being 12th, and if he'd made a better start, he might have had a chance of nicking that final point instead of Haas. He's just languishing down at the back with his teammate. So I kind of see them as a little bit of a kind of lower resolution of Mercedes, really. Mercedes took wing off to try and have more straight line speed, but it didn't really fundamentally make any difference to their race overall. They weren't way more competitive on one of their weaker tracks. You have to kind of go with the crowd and try and add load and try and have a car that works across the broadest range of circuits you can. Otherwise, you're just not going to be a serious contender for points in races, especially as more teams get more competitive. You know, the Alpine have been disappointing, but you haven't got McLaren also to pick off this year for the early races. You've got 5 teams who are kind of clogging up the top 10. And as we said at the start of the show, or near the start of the show, it's can you pick off Lance Stroll? And even that's going to be quite difficult. So I think Williams has to go through this and look at overall, is there kind of the basement of their performance going up? And I think if you compare Albon's performance in qualifying last year to this year in Saudi Arabia, it's a step forward for them. I think just getting the points is going to be more difficult than it was, and Williams will have to look beyond that and say, well, actually what we're doing fundamentally in terms of philosophy and with the car, that's going to stand us in good stead in the years ahead. And if that journey is worth sacrificing 1 year of maybe being outstanding in 2 or 3 places.
Yeah, and I think Alex Albon's kind of accepted that's where they are now, which is probably makes it a bit more difficult, as you say, but it's a net positive for the team. A question now from Don Anderson, who said, would there be any value in F1 opening up the damper restrictions to allow the IndyCar-style J dampers? It is kind of strange that F1 is the most sophisticated racing series in the world, yet IndyCar has better tech available for this important feature of the vehicle. There have been complaints that this year's cars are harder to follow, so perhaps if it was easier to maintain a stable mechanical platform, which of course would then keep the aero in the proper operating range, the racing would improve. Thoughts? Yeah, there's obviously a few arguments for why you might want to do this. I'm not sure it's a given the racing would improve if you had greater control of the suspension, because it's just more tools for different people to make better use of. I think it would be naive to think that, I mean, a J damper in itself won't solve all these problems. It's a useful tool, but it's not powerful enough to eliminate all the problems they have with platform control. And even if you made it, I mean, you could make it open season, allow all kind of hydraulic stuff, allow mass dampers, this, that, and the other. That would all help. And obviously you can absorb vertical oscillations and that kind of thing with it, although it'd still be an issue and a challenge. So, yeah, I think it's something F1 will probably have to be fairly careful of, because the reason for banning this kind of thing, obviously J dampers were banned under the current rule set for 22, along with the hydraulic linkages, was that the bigger teams were felt to be getting a bigger advantage from what they were doing. And by having it simpler, that would make it more fair. And yes, it means everyone's still got access to the same equipment and limited, restricted, conventional suspensions, but still certain teams are better at it than others, and that'll always be the case. There's also an argument you could allow active ride, and that would solve it. Kind of philosophically, that's the most obvious answer if you really wanted to go down this route. However, you would then say, well, you might want a standard active ride system, which sounds nice on paper, but actually it's not that easy to have a standard system with differences in terms of how people are designing their suspension, and then you'd need different control systems, and there's all sorts of ways. Generally speaking, better teams will do more with whatever they've got, whether it's simpler, more complex, etc. So I'm not sure it's a guarantee the racing would improve. Glenn, a question from Ansi Rolamo now, who says, the F1 grid being closer than ever at the moment has been getting praise, but doesn't it also make overtaking more difficult? Overtaking usually requires some sort of performance gap between the cars, and or at least one car being a bit out of position. I'm not saying that cars being close is a bad thing, but some people use the number of overtakes as a metric for the quality of racing.
Yeah, I don't think number of overtakes is the best metric for the quality of racing, particularly in an era of DRS and drive-by overtakes. You know, Ben talked earlier about how DRS racing has become so automated now. It's almost racing and overtaking by AI, isn't it? So I think the difference in performance that you need for kind of overtaking to happen naturally is so big that we don't want to go back to an F1 where the performance spread is that big between cars, because overall, usually what you get would be worse. A close field is great, unless you have an outlier like Red Bull at the moment. But even within that, you will still sometimes get boring races. So I think if you took the Red Bulls out of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, you still have a boring race that Charles Leclerc wins quite comfortably. I think his margin would have been something like 14 seconds. That's okay, though, because you get a good season, because you go from week to week not knowing necessarily who's going to get it right. And that's fine. I saw something very recently, actually, people talking about 2010 as a classic F1 season. 2010 had a great title fight. There weren't that many great races. But in a way, that was okay, because even when there wasn't much going on, it meant something, because everybody had to be getting the most out of every weekend. So I would always go for close competition over loads of overtakes. Ansi's also hinted at something a little bit different that we won't get into now, talking about a car being a bit out of position. And that would solve some of F1's problems at the moment.
Yeah, it's the old thing about start them in pace order and be surprised when they don't all pass each other endlessly. So, yeah, I mean, ultimately you want the cars to be close in terms of performance, but you need to find a way to create the offsets that create overtaking. It's extremely difficult to get.
Comes back to variables.
Exactly. And trying to artificially create the variables tends to have some unintended consequences as well. Ben, a question from Matt Dowland, who says, given the monotony, how do guys like yourselves maintain interest in F1 given it's now almost not worth watching the race live? Fair play
because
to
we've lived it before.
Well, exactly, yeah. Fair play to Red Bull. Having watched F1 for over 30 years, I've never known anything like it. But in 2005, the F1 FIA changed the rules to stop Schumacher and even tweak things for Hamilton and Merck in 2021. Only this is more dominant. Is the only way to stop the monotony continuing to somehow disrupt things?
Oh, that's my job, isn't it? So I have to pay attention regardless of how dominant one team is.
Is that the only reason you're still here?
No, I'm joking. If you're as invested in Formula One as we are, then you just take it as, the rub of the green. This is what happens in Formula One. There are periods of dominance. I would accept that in the last 10 or 11 seasons, there have been more seasons as a percentage where one car has just been clearly the best compared to, say, the 2000s or even the 2010s. You always want a season more like even 22 where you've got, even if it's the second team isn't quite all there, they're at least able to nick a few more pole positions and race wins for part of the season. But I don't really mind. It's up to the competition to do a better job. I'd much prefer it that way round than the top team being pegged back by some kind of artifice in the rules. I would say in more recent times, the rule changes, although the 21 rules did hurt Mercedes and it made a great title fight, it was also a kind of happy accident of COVID and the need to carry the cars over and the Pirelli tyres not being able to withstand the increasing loads. A lot of the time the rules are being changed because the cars are getting too fast and producing too much downforce, and they need to find a way to kind of reset everything and bring the teams back. And that happened again in 22, but we get to, now a couple of years down the line, 3 winters down the line, and they found it all back somehow, and we're going quicker than ever. And then the cars get, harder to follow and the quality of the racing goes down. I think also now with things being more restrictive and also F1 pushing a little bit uncomfortably into more one make territory where there are more parts controlled, some open source design, fewer areas for people to develop their own things for cost reasons. Plus the cost cap itself, by its nature, if one team manages to find an advantage, it's much easier to lock that in for a period of time and much harder for other teams to catch it up if they're missing a trick. So you have to then settle into the fact that one team's done a better job and just enjoy the ride. There's always interesting things to talk about. We spent most of this show talking about how bad a job Mercedes have done under this rule set. So
even that's getting old though, isn't it?
It is getting old, but it has been interesting in itself to follow the story of a gigantic dominant team just losing its way, over a number of seasons, and how and why that is and whether or not they can get it back. That's not particularly a news story in terms of it's happened before in past periods of F1. But I find Formula One and that whole mix of man and machine, rather than it just being purely mechanical performance or purely human performance, endlessly fascinating, because where the line is in terms of one over the other is always shifting.
I just want to pick up on the 2005 reference in Matt's question, because I have a theory that obviously back then that was Ferrari's dominance that was curbed, and that happened in 2003 as well. So after Ferrari's 2 most dominant seasons, 02 and 04, the Bernie Ecclestone-led F1 pulled the trigger and did something to shake it up. And both times, I would argue, gave us classic seasons. I find it very interesting that Stefano Domenicali-led F1 that we have today didn't pull the trigger, despite F1 being so kind of entertainment and commercial focused now. So you could say that was a brave decision. I think he and his organisation backed Mercedes and Ferrari to get it right, or hoped that they would. But I also wonder, when Bernie messed with things, or got Max Mosley to mess with things to shake things up, Domenicali was at Ferrari when they got shafted. So is that in his mind going, I know what it's like to be doing the best job and then to have kind of all the pieces on the board get shaken up, and it's suddenly you're on the back foot through no fault of your own. I wonder if just his background has conditioned him to say, no, if you're doing the best job, it's up to the others to catch up. However, I think if we have another season like the one we had last year, he's going to be under a lot of pressure within F1, and it might be harder to avoid shaking things up in the future.
I think across the board, Domenicali's mainly interested in the share price, isn't he? That seems to be the only thing that he's particularly worried about. Now,
surely that goes down once the TV ratings keep dropping, though. TV ratings are dropped the last 2 years.
Well, that's very true. But I mean, I'm not making a case for interference, but just generally as an observation about F1, I think, particularly in the Domenicali-led era, they lack the behind-the-skills nous to actually achieve a great deal. I think there's a lot they could have done that they haven't done. And this is sort of in that area. If you argue that you did want to see that happening, which I'm not necessarily doing there, I'm not sure they have the wherewithal to pull it off.
I think the only Trojan horse that Formula One might be able to hide some fundamental rule changes behind is maybe this issue of following and the fact that the whole ground effect era was predicated on making the racing closer and the actual on-track racing easier. And we've found, particularly this year, a groundswell of opinion among the drivers that actually following is getting harder again because the teams have found more downforce, recovered the losses that the original rule change implemented. So they could use that as an excuse, a bit like with Merck in 21, to say, oh, we need to mix things up because we're not achieving one of our fundamental aims in terms of bringing this rule set in. But with 2026 coming and new engines and revisions anyway, that's going to be the time. And even the noises coming out of the FIA say nothing fundamental is going to be done until 2026. You know, you can't change it this year in season, and then you've only got 2025 before the rules change anyway.
Next, a question from Martin McNulty I'll take. Does F1 have a good reason for continuing to enforce a minimum weight? If we now have a functioning cost cap to make every team profitable, and if we agree to keep all the same chassis impact test, survival cell strength regs, and other safety-oriented required parts, then why have a minimum weight at all? Well, I think that's a good question. There is a reason for it in that they don't want anybody to get a big advantage in this kind of thing. I personally would agree that actually under the cost cap, there's no reason why they can't have the minimum weight changes. You say, keep all the other regs in that you've got to comply with. Why not? James Allison argued this quite eloquently last year, and I think he's absolutely right. There's no reason. It's only the fear that you'll get a bigger competitive spread because someone will find a way to take weight off and that'll be a big advantage. But ultimately, as we've talked about with racing, variables is important, and it'd be interesting if you had a situation where somebody has gone lighter to gain performance that way and someone else has said, actually, we'll have a car that's a bit heavier, but we think we've got performance to deploy elsewhere, and then you'll get bigger swings from track to track, more variables. So yeah,
I like it.
I think it's a good idea. Glenn, a question from Andy Sally, who says, my question is about how rookie F1 drivers are rated on their debut race. In my opinion, I think Ollie Behrman was very impressive considering he hadn't a lot of seat time in an F1 car. I know he drove the Haas in 2023 in 2 different practice sessions and then had an hour of practice before qualifying and the race. I know De Vries had an impressive debut, but he had more experience in F1 machinery through end of season test days and P1 appearances. In your opinion, are there other F1 drivers that had impressive debut races as substitute drivers? Remember Alex Wurz in 1997 when he raced for Benetton in Canada, France and Britain where he finished third. Also David Coulthard comes to mind when he raced for Williams in 94. It's an obvious question for you, Glenn, given you're Mr. Bring Back V10s.
Yeah, I've got a few V10 era examples. So the most, you can help me out with this, but the most recent one, I guess, that applies in this way, so a debut as a stand-in would be Stoffel Vandoorne, 2016.
Yep.
Did quite a good job. And the Vandoorne comparison is interesting because I think he was as highly rated back then as Behrman is becoming now. And obviously it didn't work out for Stoffel for various reasons. Going back further, the ones that Behrman, I think, would want to emulate, Sebastian Vettel filled in at BMW for a race for Robert Kubica. I think ended up with a point on his debut, maybe after a disqualification, moved him up a place. And Michael Schumacher made his debut as a stand-in driver, of course, in the 1991 Belgian Grand Prix. Didn't get very far, but made a big impression. Others, let's have some from the V10 era, shall we? Jean Alesi was initially just a stand-in driver, filling in for Tyrrell at the French Grand Prix. They were telling him, "Oh, just see if you can qualify. That would be a good job." Back when qualifying was quite difficult, when you had 39 cars trying to get on the grid, and he was brilliant. Finished 4th in the points and never looked back. A couple of lower profile ones. Luciano Berti got his debut at Jaguar. Similar circumstances, actually. I think, was that appendicitis for Eddie Irvine that gave him his debut in 2000, and then he raced for Jaguar the next season, not that successfully. And a total one-off, Stefan Sarazan got his debut and never raced in F1 again. Brazil 99 with Minardi, which, if you haven't seen it, look up what happened to him in that race. The world's longest and most aggressive and frightening spin after crashing. Well worth a look.
Yeah, and of course the most fun one, I guess, was the Marcus Winkelhock run, wasn't it, with a spiker when he led in
another proper one-off.
Bizarre circumstances, yeah, a genuine one-off outing. Ben, a question now for you from Lachlan Grant, who says, as a McLaren fan, I'm in two minds about the start of the season. On the one hand, we are way ahead of the beginning of 2023, but on the other hand, we seem to have lost ground at the start of 2024. Is this just me overanalyzing, or has McLaren started a little behind the 8 ball?
Maybe a little bit behind the 8 ball. I think, especially considering how punchy that team was in its off-season chat.
That's it. Their own rhetoric didn't help.
Yeah, they were talking about, no flatlining of the development curve that they saw last year that was so impressive. They knew how to attack the remaining weaknesses in terms of predictability on the limit and also the low speed weaknesses that are long standing. And we kind of haven't, again, small sample set, we kind of haven't really seen them take a step. That said, they did a huge amount of work last year, got themselves into the top group of teams, and they've started this year in much, much better shape than they started last season. They haven't lost ground. They're still in that zone. So they can be encouraged, but it's taking that next step. It's obviously proving more difficult than they predicted. So now the talk is of a longer term plan, maybe, to eliminate some of those weaknesses. And they, a bit like Williams for different reasons, they obviously don't want to chuck away what is a really, really good car in high speed corners by making it kind of more broadly competitive. And maybe they're a little bit stuck in terms of balancing that out. But overall, you have to be, as a McLaren fan, you'd have to be pretty content because they've got two really good drivers and they've started this season much, much stronger than they did 12 months ago and in roughly the same place as they finished last season.
Yeah, and I think it's going to take a little bit of time for McLaren to work at their weaknesses. So it's still all going in the right direction for them, but perhaps not as quickly as they would ideally hope. A question from Tim Walters, who says, all too soon, F1 is going to stage the first sprint race of the year. No matter how it plays out, a lot of fans and drivers and journalists are going to be unhappy. Can you explain why F1 can't or won't revive a pro car style race for the sprints? The fans would love it, as we finally get to see our heroes in equal machinery and trading paint. The drivers would love it and wouldn't stop laughing the entire time. The teams would love it since they don't own the cars. And F1 and Liberty should love it since they finally have a sprint format that everyone loves. Any potential brand conflict could be alleviated by having a specialist like ProDrive create a GT3 type sedan specifically for the series. Well, it's certainly a fun idea. Obviously, the Pro Car days were very, very fondly remembered, and some great racing in that. I think the problem is that, firstly, F1's desire for sprint races is desired by having more F1, and I think they wouldn't want a non-F1 race to be part of that, no matter how fun it is. I think, yes, you're right that you could create a GT3 type sedan, especially for it, but that's quite expensive. So who's going to pay for it? Because I think if F1 did this, they would love the idea of a car company paying a lot of money in order to do it, because that's always very good for the share price as well. So that creates a conflict there. I just think it's from a time when contracts were simply much more flexible in terms of this kind of thing, and you could do it. I just don't think it's viable, but it would be absolutely fantastic. I'd love to see it, but yeah, I just don't think it fits in on many levels.
If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. I just want to quickly come in here. I think the new sprint format for this year has had an easy ride on this podcast. From the discussions I've heard you guys have about it, you all seem to say, yep, great step in the right direction. Sprint Saturday was rubbish. Oh, while I wasn't a massive fan of Sprint Saturday, I think the new sprint format is worse. We've now got you've got a missable session on Friday instead of an important one in sprint qualifying. And the sprint race F1 have basically shown us that the sprint race isn't important, which is what all the fans were saying already, because they've put it before qualifying. So on the Saturday, the sprint race is now the sideshow, which I don't think makes any sense either. So they've made it all less relevant, and I think they've just opened themselves up to even more criticism this year about what is the point of this format, but a debate for another time.
I'd certainly argue, although it's an improvement, I'm not sure we said it's a great step in the right direction. I certainly didn't anyway, because I'm not a big
I don't think it's an improvement. That was my original point. I'm not saying that you're massive supporters of it, but I disagree with the suggestion that it's better than what we had before.
I do think it's better just because it makes the completely pointless. At least there's a bit of a ramp up through the weekend. I still think the sprint race, if you're going to do them, are a huge missed opportunity, though. There's so much more they could do. But sadly, I feel like a pro car style race isn't going to
Unfortunately.
Yeah, it'd be great if it could. Glenn, a question for you from Urban Stenchan, who says, how soon can we see team orders in Mercedes if Russell is going to outperform Hamilton in the next races?
Well, if Russell's outperforming Lewis, I think they'd be fine with that. They wouldn't need to do anything. There's no need for team orders at Mercedes. You only really do team orders if you've got a championship to fight for. As we discussed much earlier in this show, Mercedes aren't fighting for a championship this year. I think they won't have a preference out of Russell and Hamilton in terms of a preference they would want to interfere with. They'd obviously be delighted if the driver who's staying outperforms the driver who's leaving this year, but they're not going to do anything to engineer that. So there's going to be no team orders at Merc.
Yeah, purely situational team orders, perhaps, when they've interfering strategies, but not
which they'll both argue about. These two are very good at that, aren't they? They're
Yes.
good whingers on the radio when they're too close to
We
each
need to
other.
work together. No, we need to stop working together. He's holding me up.
Everyone loves a bit of collaboration when it's on their terms, don't they?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, finally, a question for you, Ben, from Thomas Knights, who says, after 2 weekends with a Verstappen-Leclerc front row, with both Alpines, Kick Saubers and Sargent going out in Q1, followed by Red Bull 1-2 with a Ferrari in a comfortable third, how much danger is there of the season becoming very predictable?
Well, there certainly is some danger of that, mainly because of how much better the Red Bull seems again than everyone else. Even Sergio Perez isn't having as hard a time getting performance out of that car this year, managing to finish second in the first 2 races. After that, I think it looks quite tight, but you've got this clear split of the top 5, top 1 team, then the 4, and then the remaining 5. But I do like the fact that the whole field has condensed a bit, and that portion of the grid from team 2 down to team 10 is much closer, because it's not so, and we've seen this already, I think, in the first 2 qualifying sessions of the year, it's not so easy for teams to conserve tyres anymore. A lot of the time last season, Max Verstappen especially, but also others, were able to kind of save their tyres until their soft tyres until the end, until Q3. You can't really do that anymore. We needed that kind of experimental qualifying format where you had to use each compound through the segments to kind of equalise it. Yeah, I liked it because it stopped this hoarding of tyres that a driver with a car advantage could do. But the natural closing of the field, as everyone's found performance over the winter, is kind of taking care of that. Not fully, but it is encouraging to see that actually the spread is so close from being in the top 10 in Q1 right down to 20th place, that actually if a driver just hasn't got quite the right setup, or they make a mistake, they will underperform and allow someone to beat them.
Yeah, I think we will see a bit more variety as the season goes on, although I don't think it's going to become super unpredictable. Let's make that one very clear. Well, thanks to everyone for your questions. Thanks to Ben and Glenn for your answers. Do head to therace.com, plenty to read there. Have a listen to our other podcast, Bring Back V10s, starring Glenn Freeman. Season 9 is there for your listening pleasure, and also the Race F1 Tech Show, which we referred to earlier with the legend that is Gary Anderson. We're going to be making the long journey to Australia soon, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.